I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Brenda Patterson standing at my workshop door with her phone pressed against her ear, and that particular scowl she reserved for when things weren't going her way. My name is Gregory Garrison, and I had been living peacefully in the Sunset Meadows subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona, for 3 years before Brenda became the HOA president 6 months ago. Since then, my life had become a series of increasingly ridiculous confrontations about everything from the exact shade of my mailbox to the height of my grass, measured down to the millimeter. I was in the middle of cutting steel plates for a custom fire pit I was building for my backyard when I noticed her through the window. The plasma cutter in my hand hummed with power as I finished the last cut, sparks dancing across my workspace. I shut it down and pulled off my welding helmet, already feeling the tension building in my shoulders. Brenda never showed up at my place unless she wanted something or had another complaint to lodge. I stepped outside into the warm Arizona afternoon, squinting against the sun. Brenda was in her mid-40s, with blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, wearing her usual uniform of expensive athleisure where that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She lowered her phone as I approached, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Gregory, I need to borrow your plasma cutter," she announced without preamble, not a request, a demand. I wiped my hands on my work jeans and tried to keep my voice level. "Hello to you too, Brenda, and no, I don't lend out my tools. Especially not something as expensive and dangerous as a plasma cutter," her eyes narrowed. "This is an emergency. My husband is working on an art installation for the community center entrance, and his cutting torch broke. The unveiling is in 3 days, and we need to finish it. As HOA president, I'm requisitioning your equipment for community use." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Requisitioning? This isn't the military, Brenda. That's my personal property, and it cost me over $2,000. The answer is no. The HOA bylaws clearly state that homeowners should contribute to community improvement projects," she said, her voice taking on that shrill quality that made my teeth ache. "Contributing doesn't mean surrendering my expensive tools so your husband can use them," I replied. "Tell him to rent one from Home Depot. They have equipment rentals." Brenda's face flushed red. "This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that undermines community spirit. I should have known you wouldn't help. You've been nothing but difficult since I took over as president. Difficult. I've paid every fine you've thrown at me, even the ridiculous ones. I repainted my shutters 3 times to get the exact shade you wanted. I replaced my doormat because you said it wasn't neutral enough. But I'm not handing over a $2,000 piece of equipment that could seriously injure someone who doesn't know how to use it properly." She pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. "I'm sending an email to the HOA board right now. We'll see what they have to say about your refusal to cooperate with community initiatives." "You do that," I said, turning back toward my workshop. "The answer is still no." I heard her stomp off, her designer sneakers slapping against the concrete driveway. I went back inside and locked the workshop door behind me. My workshop was a converted 2-car garage that I'd spent months turning into a proper workspace. I had everything from woodworking tools to metalworking equipment, all organized and maintained with care. It was my sanctuary, the place where I could escape from the increasingly insane demands of the HOA. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 32 text messages. Most were from Brenda, each one more aggressive than the last. The messages started with thinly veiled threats about HOA violations and escalated to claims that I was in breach of community standards. The final message, sent at 2 in the morning, simply read, "You'll regret this decision." I forwarded all the messages to my lawyer, Tom Henderson, who I'd unfortunately had to put on retainer after the 3rd month of Brenda's presidency. Tom had dealt with several HOA disputes before and had warned me that Brenda was showing signs of what he called petty tyrant syndrome. something he'd seen in HOA presidents who let a small amount of power go to their heads. I called Tom from my kitchen while making coffee. He answered on the second ring. "Let me guess," he said. "Brenda. She wants to requisition my plasma cutter for her husband's art project. When I said no, she sent me threatening messages all night." Tom sighed. "She can't requisition anything. HOAs don't have that authority over personal property. Save all those messages. They might come in handy if this escalates." "If," I asked. "When," Tom corrected. "People like Brenda don't take no for an answer. She'll try something else. Just make sure your workshop is secure and don't engage with her directly anymore. All communication should go through me." I followed his advice and spent the morning adding a better lock to my workshop door. The old one was just a standard deadbolt, but I upgraded to a heavy-duty padlock system on the exterior and reinforced the door frame. If Brenda thought she could just walk in and take my equipment, she had another thing coming. That afternoon, I got a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a notice of violation claiming that my workshop was operating as an unauthorized commercial business, and that I was in violation of the community's commercial activity restrictions. It demanded that I cease all operations immediately and pay a fine of $500. I wasn't running a business. I built things for myself and occasionally helped neighbors with projects for free. I called Tom again. "They're trying to pressure you by making your life miserable," he explained. "Don't pay the fine. I'll send them a response stating that you're not operating a commercial business and that their claim is baseless. This is harassment, Gregory. Document everything." The next 2 days were a blur of increasingly petty violations. Brenda claimed my trash cans were visible from the street for 3 minutes past the allowed time. She said my car was parked at an angle that violated parking guidelines. She even tried to cite me for noise violations, claiming my workshop was too loud, even though I only worked during permitted hours and my nearest neighbor was 300 feet away. Each violation came with a fine. Each fine was sent to Tom, who responded with detailed refutations. The HOA board seemed to be rubber stamping everything Brenda put in front of them, which didn't surprise me. The board consisted of her tennis partner, her next-door neighbor, and her husband's business associate. It was a kangaroo court. On the 3rd day after my initial refusal, I had to leave for a welding job in Phoenix. I worked as a structural welder for a commercial construction company, and we had a major project deadline. I'd be gone for about 10 hours, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. I made sure everything in my workshop was locked up tight before I left. When I returned home that evening, exhausted and covered in metal dust, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The exterior light over my workshop door was on, but I distinctly remembered turning it off. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. The padlock I'd installed was lying on the ground, cut cleanly through with what looked like a plasma cutter. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and felt rage surge through me. My workshop had been ransacked. Tools were scattered across the floor, my organized workbench was a mess, and most importantly, my plasma cutter was gone. The expensive Miller Spectrum 875 I'd saved up for months to buy was missing from its place on the wall. I immediately called the police. While I waited for them to arrive, I checked my security camera. I'd installed one a month ago after Brenda had tried to claim I was violating landscaping rules, and I wanted evidence of when I actually did my yard work. The camera had a view of my driveway and part of the workshop entrance. The footage was damning. At around 2 in the afternoon, Brenda's white Mercedes SUV pulled into my driveway. She got out, looked around nervously, and approached my workshop door. She tried the handle first, then pulled something from her large purse. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing. She had a plasma cutter, a small handheld unit, and she was cutting through my padlock. The camera captured everything. Her face when the lock finally gave way. The way she pushed the door open and went inside. She emerged 20 minutes later carrying my plasma cutter, struggling with its weight. She loaded it into her SUV and drove away. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Brenda Patterson, HOA president, pillar of the community, had just committed breaking and entering and theft, on camera. When the police arrived, I showed them the footage. Officers Martinez and Chen watched it twice, their expressions growing more serious each time. "That's pretty clear-cut," Officer Martinez said. "Breaking and entering, theft of property over $1,000, criminal damage." "Do you know this woman?" "She's my HOA president," I said. "She demanded to borrow my plasma cutter a few days ago. I refused. This is retaliation." Officer Chen was taking notes. "Do you have the serial number for the stolen plasma cutter?" I did. I kept records of all my tools for insurance purposes. I provided them with the serial number, purchase receipt, and the value. I also gave them copies of all the text messages Brenda had sent me, including the one where she said I'd regret my decision. "We'll go have a conversation with Mrs. Patterson," Officer Martinez said. "Given the clear video evidence and the premeditation shown in these messages, we'll likely be making an arrest." "What happens to my plasma cutter?" I asked. "If it's at her residence, we'll recover it as evidence." "You'll get it back eventually, but it might be a while if this goes to trial." I filed a formal report and gave them Brenda's address. She lived in the same subdivision, just 6 streets over in one of the larger houses. After the officers left, I called Tom and updated him on everything. "This is actually good for you," Tom said, though his voice was serious. "This goes way beyond HOA disputes now. She's committed multiple felonies. Save everything. We're going to file a restraining order first thing tomorrow morning, and I think we have grounds for a lawsuit against both Brenda personally and the HOA for harassment." I spent the next hour cleaning up my workshop and documenting all the damage. Besides the plasma cutter, nothing else appeared to be stolen, but she'd gone through my tool cabinets and knocked things over, probably looking for the specific tool she wanted. There was about $300 in damage to my organizational systems and a broken cabinet lock. My phone rang around 9 that evening. It was Officer Martinez. "Mr. Garrison, I wanted to update you. We located Mrs. Patterson at her residence. Your plasma cutter was in her garage, still in her vehicle." When we confronted her with the video evidence, she initially denied everything, then claimed she had authorization as HOA president to enter your property and confiscate equipment being used in violation of community standards. "That's insane," I said. "She has no such authority." We explained that to her. She became increasingly agitated and belligerent. We arrested her for burglary in the 2nd degree, theft, and criminal damage. She's currently being processed at the Scottsdale City Jail. Your plasma cutter has been taken as evidence, but we've documented its condition. It appears undamaged. I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that she'd been caught, satisfaction that there were consequences for her actions, but also anxiety about what would come next. Brenda wasn't the type to go quietly. "Thank you, officers," I said. "I appreciate you handling this so quickly." "The evidence was clear," Officer Martinez replied. "Cases like this are straightforward. She'll have an initial appearance tomorrow morning. Given the value of the stolen property and the premeditation, the prosecutor will probably take this seriously." After we hung up, I sat in my workshop for a long time, just processing everything. I'd moved to Sunset Meadows because it seemed like a nice, quiet community. The houses were well maintained, the neighborhood was safe, and the amenities were decent. I never imagined I'd end up in a situation where the HOA president would break into my property and steal from me. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 6. The first call was from Dennis Patterson, Brenda's husband. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail claiming this was all a misunderstanding and that I was overreacting. The second call was from Linda Morrison, one of the HOA board members. She was more confrontational, saying I should drop the charges and work this out within the community. I forwarded both messages to Tom and blocked their numbers. By noon, Tom had filed for a restraining order against Brenda, and we drafted a lawsuit against her personally for harassment, theft, and emotional distress, along with a separate suit against the HOA for enabling her behavior and failing in their fiduciary duty to manage the community properly. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By evening, I'd had 3 different neighbors stop by to talk. 2 were supportive, sharing their own horror stories about Brenda's overreach. 1, Mrs. Chen from down the street, told me Brenda had tried to fine her $800 for having the wrong type of rosebush in her front yard. The 3rd visitor was less friendly. Harrison Stone lived next to Brenda and was on the HOA board. He stood on my porch with his arms crossed, his face red with anger. "You're destroying this community," he said. "Brenda made a mistake, but having her arrested, filing lawsuits, you're tearing us apart." "She broke into my workshop and stole a $2,000 tool," I replied calmly. "After harassing me for months with bogus violations and threatening messages. This isn't about the community. This is about someone who thinks being HOA president means she can do whatever she wants without consequences. The board is going to make your life hell for this," Harrison threatened. "The board can try," I said. "But my lawyer is already preparing to depose every board member about what you knew regarding Brenda's harassment. If you enabled her behavior, you're liable too. Now get off my property." He left, muttering threats under his breath. I made sure to document his visit in my growing file of evidence. Brenda's initial appearance was the next day. Tom attended and called me afterward with the details. Brenda had pled not guilty and been released on her own recognizance with conditions, including no contact with me and no entry onto my property. The restraining order was granted. Her trial date was set for 2 months out. "She looked pretty shaken," Tom said. "I don't think she expected actual consequences. Her lawyer tried to argue that this was a community dispute that got out of hand, but the judge wasn't having it. The video evidence is too clear." "What about the HOA lawsuit?" I asked. "We filed it this morning. I'm serving them tomorrow." "I'm also going to send a demand letter to the board requiring them to remove Brenda from her position as president pending the criminal trial. If they refuse, it shows they're endorsing her criminal behavior." The next week was surreal. Half the neighborhood seemed to support me, while the other half thought I was destroying community harmony. Someone started an online petition calling for my removal from the HOA, which was legally impossible since I owned my property. Someone else started a counter-petition demanding the entire HOA board resign. The local news picked up the story. A reporter named Jessica Tran from Channel 12 contacted me for an interview. Tom advised me to do it, saying public pressure might help push for a resolution. The interview aired on a Thursday evening. Jessica asked straightforward questions about the timeline of events, and I showed her the security footage. The video of Brenda cutting through my lock and stealing my plasma cutter went viral online. Within 24 hours, it had over 2 million views. The reaction was swift. The HOA's management company, Summit Community Management, released a statement distancing themselves from Brenda's actions and announcing they were conducting an internal review. 2 of the board members, including Harrison Stone, resigned. The remaining board member, Patricia Wells, called an emergency meeting and voted to suspend Brenda from her position as president. Brenda's lawyer reached out to Tom with a plea deal offer. She'd plead guilty to misdemeanor theft and criminal damage in exchange for dropping the burglary charge, pay full restitution including my legal fees, and resign from the HOA board permanently. "What do you think?" Tom asked me when we met to discuss it. I thought about it carefully. On one hand, I wanted to see her face the full consequences of her actions. On the other hand, a trial would drag this out for months and cost me time and money. "What does the prosecutor think?" I asked. "He's willing to accept it." Burglary in the second degree is a serious charge, but given that she has no criminal history and the property was recovered undamaged, he thinks a judge might go light on sentencing anyway. This way, she has a criminal conviction on her record, you get compensated, and she's barred from the HOA. What about the civil lawsuit? We keep that. The HOA's separate liability doesn't go away because Brenda took a plea deal. We have evidence that the board enabled her harassment campaign. I think we can win a significant settlement. Okay, I said. I'll accept the plea deal for the criminal case, but we push forward on the civil case. Brenda accepted the plea deal the following week. She appeared before the judge looking nothing like the imperious HOA president I'd dealt with. She was pale, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a plain dress instead of her usual expensive outfits. She pled guilty to theft and criminal damage, was sentenced to 2 years probation, ordered to pay complete restitution of nearly $8,000 including my legal fees and damages, and had to complete 100 hours of community service. The judge also gave her a lecture about the responsibilities of community leadership and how she'd betrayed the trust of her neighbors. It was satisfying to watch, though I mostly felt tired. This whole situation had consumed months of my life. Getting my plasma cutter back took another 2 weeks of paperwork, but eventually I retrieved it from the evidence lockup. It was undamaged, just as the officers had said. I installed it back in my workshop, which now had an even better security system including multiple cameras and a reinforced steel door. The civil lawsuit against the HOA moved forward. During depositions, we uncovered a pattern of abuse that went beyond just my case. Brenda had systematically targeted homeowners she didn't like with excessive fines and violations. The HOA's own records showed she'd issued 3 times as many violation notices as the previous president, and many of them were for trivial or invented infractions. The HOA's insurance company pushed for a settlement. They didn't want this going to trial with all the evidence we'd compiled. After negotiations, we reached a settlement of $45,000. The agreement also required the HOA to implement new bylaws limiting the president's authority, establishing an appeals process for violations, and requiring board decisions to be made by majority vote rather than presidential decree. The money was nice, but more importantly, the changes to the bylaws meant future residents wouldn't face the same kind of harassment. The HOA also had to send a formal apology letter to every homeowner Brenda had cited during her tenure, offering to review and potentially refund questionable fines. Patricia Wells became interim president and reached out to me personally to apologize. She'd been the newest board member and admitted she'd been intimidated by Brenda and went along with things she knew were wrong. I should have stood up to her, Patricia said when she came to my house to deliver the settlement check personally. I knew some of those violations were ridiculous, but she was so forceful and I didn't want to rock the boat. I'm sorry you had to go through all this. I appreciate that, I said. I hope the new bylaws prevent this from happening to anyone else. They will, she promised. We're also bringing in a new management company with better oversight. Summit dropped us after all this publicity, but honestly, that's probably for the best. They weren't doing their job either. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on actual community issues like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, rather than harassing homeowners over minor aesthetic preferences. I started working on projects in my workshop again without constantly worrying about what violation notice would show up next. I ran into Brenda once, about 4 months after everything was resolved. I was at the grocery store, pushing my cart down the cereal aisle when I saw her coming from the opposite direction. For a moment, we just looked at each other. She looked older, tired. The arrogance that had defined her was gone. She started to say something, then stopped. I nodded slightly and kept walking. There was nothing to say. She'd made her choices and she'd paid the consequences. I didn't hate her anymore. I just wanted to move on with my life. The whole experience taught me a lot about standing up for yourself and not letting people abuse whatever small authority they have. It also taught me about the importance of documentation. If I hadn't had those text messages, that security footage, and Tom's legal expertise, things could have gone very differently. My workshop is better than ever now. I've added more storage, upgraded some equipment, and even started teaching basic welding classes to a few neighbors who expressed interest. The new HOA board approved it as a community enrichment activity, which would have been unthinkable under Brenda's reign. One of my students is actually Brenda's husband, Dennis. He approached me 6 months after everything was settled, apologetic and humble. His marriage to Brenda had ended in divorce. He told me she'd been under a lot of stress from her own business failing and had channeled all her anxiety into controlling the HOA. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it provided some context. "I'm not asking you to forgive her," Dennis said during one of our welding sessions. "I just wanted you to know that she's getting help, therapy, anger management. She knows she messed up badly." "I hope she gets better," I said honestly. "Nobody should live with that much anger." Dennis turned out to be a decent guy and a quick learner. He finished the art installation for the community center using a rented plasma cutter, and it actually looked pretty good. It was an abstract metal sculpture representing community unity, which was ironic given the circumstances, but art is like that sometimes. The community center unveiled it at a summer barbecue. Most of the neighborhood turned out, and for the first time in months, the atmosphere felt light and friendly rather than tense and divided. Kids played on the lawn, people chatted over burgers and potato salad, and nobody mentioned HOA violations or property disputes. Patricia came over to where I was standing with a plate of food. "This feels like what the neighborhood should have been all along," she said. "Yeah," I agreed. "Took a while to get here, though. Was it worth it? All the stress and legal battles," I thought about it. The months of harassment, the break-in, the court dates, the depositions. But then I thought about the changes we'd made, the protections now in place for other homeowners, and the fact that I could work in my workshop without fear. "Yeah," I said, "it was worth it." Tom joined us, holding a beer and looking more relaxed than I'd seen him during the entire legal process. "You know what the best part of this whole thing is?" he asked. "What's that?" "I've gotten 3 new clients from this neighborhood in the past month. Turns out when you stand up to an abusive HOA president and win, other people in bad situations take notice. I'm handling cases in 2 other subdivisions now with similar problems." "So my nightmare is good for your business?" I asked with a smile. "Your victory is good for my business," Tom corrected. "And good for a lot of other people dealing with power-hungry HOA boards." "You set a precedent here, Gregory." As the summer evening wore on and the party continued, I found myself actually enjoying being part of this community. It had taken a criminal case and a lawsuit to get here, but we'd come out the other side better for it. The new bylaws were already making a difference. The appeals process had overturned a dozen questionable violations from the previous administration, and the required board votes meant no single person could run roughshod over everyone else. I even joined the HOA board myself, a few months later, when Patricia asked if I'd be interested in filling one of the vacant positions. It seemed ironic given how much I'd fought against the HOA, but I figured if I was going to complain about how things were run, I should be willing to help run them better. The first board meeting I attended was nothing like I'd imagined during the dark days of Brenda's presidency. We discussed budget allocations for landscaping, approved a request for someone to install solar panels, and reviewed maintenance schedules for the community pool. Everything was straightforward and reasonable. When someone suggested we implement a new rule about decorative flags, I pushed back, citing the importance of reasonable accommodation for homeowner expression, and the rest of the board agreed. Working on the board gave me a new appreciation for what HOAs could be when run properly. We weren't there to micromanage people's lives or enforce arbitrary aesthetic standards. We were there to maintain property values, keep common areas nice, and help neighbors resolve disputes without things escalating. It was actually kind of rewarding. My plasma cutter became a bit of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents would hear the story and often ask to see the famous plasma cutter. I'd show it off, tell the story, and usually end up offering to help with their own projects. My workshop became an informal community resource, with neighbors stopping by to borrow tools or get help with repairs. One Saturday afternoon, I was helping a neighbor cut some metal brackets for a pergola he was building when a moving truck pulled up to the house that used to be Brenda's. She'd sold it a few months after the divorce, and the house had been on the market for a while. A young family emerged from a sedan behind the truck, a couple in their early 30s with two small kids. The husband saw me in my workshop and waved. I waved back, then walked over to introduce myself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said. "I'm Gregory Garrison, live right over there." "Mike Thompson," he said, shaking my hand. "This is my wife, Rachel, and our kids, Emma and Josh. Great to meet you all. If you need any help moving or getting settled, let me know." "Thanks," Rachel said. "We've heard this is a really nice community." "Good hoa," I smiled. "It is now. Went through some rough patches, but things have really improved. If you have any questions about the rules or need help with anything, I'm on the board. We try to keep things reasonable." "That's great to hear," Mike said. "Our last place had an HOA that was kind of a nightmare." "I understand completely," I replied. "We work hard to make sure that's not the case here." As I walked back to my workshop, I thought about how far things had come. The house where all my problems had originated was now going to be home to a nice young family. The neighborhood that had been divided was now coming together. And I'd learned that sometimes standing up to injustice, even when it's inconvenient and stressful, is the right thing to do. The plasma cutter sat in its place on my workshop wall, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It was just a tool, a piece of equipment for cutting metal, but it had become a symbol of something larger. A reminder that people can't just take what they want, that authority has limits, and that communities are stronger when they're built on respect rather than fear. I went back to working on the brackets for Mike's pergola, the plasma cutter humming as it sliced through steel. Outside, I could hear kids playing and neighbors chatting. The sound of a healthy, happy community. The sound of home. Months turned into a year, and the incident with Brenda became one of those neighborhood stories that people told newcomers. Not with anger or bitterness, but as a cautionary tale about the importance of good governance and standing up for what's right. The neighborhood had grown stronger from the experience, and the changes we'd implemented were making a real difference in people's lives. I continued teaching welding classes, now with official HOA approval and insurance coverage. We had a waiting list of people wanting to learn. Dennis finished his community service helping with neighborhood projects and actually became a regular helper at the community center. He'd found purpose in giving back after everything that had happened. As for Brenda, I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to Tucson to be closer to her sister and was working as a manager at a retail store. No HOA involvement. I hoped she'd found some peace. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes and move forward. The lawsuit settlement money went toward upgrading my workshop and creating a small scholarship fund through Tom's suggestion for local kids interested in learning trades. I figured if something good could come from all that conflict, it should benefit young people trying to build better futures. Patricia served another year as president before stepping down, feeling she'd done her part to stabilize things. The board elected a retired engineer named Robert Martinez to replace her. He ran things with efficient calm, treating the position as a responsibility rather than a power trip. I stayed on the board for 2 years before deciding I'd done my part. New people needed opportunities to serve, and I wanted to spend more time on my projects and less time in meetings. But I left knowing we'd created systems that would protect homeowners from the kind of abuse I'd experienced. The final piece of closure came when the county prosecutor's office invited me to speak at a community forum about HOA disputes and resolution strategies. They wanted to use my case as an example of how things could escalate when power went unchecked, but also how communities could heal and reform. Standing in front of about 50 people, including HOA board members from across Scottsdale, I told my story. Not to shame Brenda or complain, but to illustrate the importance of checks and balances, clear bylaws, and treating homeowners with respect. The thing is, I said near the end of my presentation, HOAs serve an important purpose. They maintain standards, preserve property values, and create community. But that only works when the people in charge remember they're servants of the community, not rulers of it. The moment someone forgets that distinction, problems start. After the presentation, several people came up to thank me and share their own stories. Some were dealing with similar situations. I gave them Tom's contact information and encouraged them to document everything and know their rights. Driving home that evening, I felt a sense of completion. The whole ordeal had been exhausting and frustrating, but it had led to meaningful change. Not just in my neighborhood, but potentially in others as word spread and people learned from what happened. My workshop light was on when I got home. I'd left it on by mistake that morning. I smiled as I walked toward it, remembering the day I'd found that cut padlock and the chaos that followed. Now the door had a solid lock, cameras covered every angle, and I had zero fear of anyone trying to break in. More importantly, I had a community that had my back. I stepped inside and looked around at my organized tools, my projects in various stages of completion, and yes, my plasma cutter hanging securely on the wall where it belonged. This was my space, my sanctuary, hard-won and well-protected. I picked up the plasma cutter and held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Such a strange thing to become the center of a criminal case, but life's like that sometimes. Small conflicts reveal larger truths. A $2,000 tool had exposed corruption, triggered reform, and ultimately helped build a stronger community. I placed it back on its hooks and turned off the light. Tomorrow I'd start working on a new project, maybe that decorative gate for the community garden that the board had approved. But tonight, I was content to sit on my back porch with a cold beer and appreciate the quiet peace of a neighborhood finally functioning the way it should. The Arizona sky darkened from orange to purple to deep blue, stars emerging one by one. Somewhere in the distance, I heard laughter from a backyard party. The sound of people enjoying their homes without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment. The sound of community done right, and my plasma cutter sat safely in my workshop, just another tool in my collection. Ready for the next project, ready to build instead of destroy. Exactly as it should be.